Hello, welcome. It's lovely to see so many of you on this very hot morning. My name's Gemma Buckley. I'm Senior Partnerships Manager at the Independent Cinema Office. I recognise actually quite a few of you on a few of your names coming up, but just in case anyone is new to the Independent Cinema Office, we are the UK's national body in support of independent film exhibitors of all forms. So we are delighted to be presenting this webinar today, which we hope will be really helpful for many of you. And I'm going to be joined by my colleague, David Sin, who's Head of Cinemas at the ICO, and also John Murray from Charity Bank. Before we get to that, just a quick bit of housekeeping. Closed captions are available by pressing the closed captions button at the bottom, and we're really hopeful that we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. So I'm going to ask that as we go along, if you could pop any questions you've got in the chat, and then I'll round them up and present them back to David and or John at the end. I think that's it from me, so I'll pass over to David.
Thank you, Gemma. Welcome to this webinar looking at the Community Ownership Fund and its relevance to independent cinemas. So the Community Ownership Fund is an opportunity for community groups to access some capital funding which might enable them to develop or to take a step towards community ownership of a local cinema in this instance. Could we have the presentation, David? Thank you. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to take you through the Community Ownership Fund and try to give you some examples of how cinemas, how different parts of the fund might be relevant to cinemas, how cinemas might apply for the fund. And then I'm going to hand over to John Murray from Charity Bank, who can tell you about the various facilities that they have available, which you might want to access in order to build up your portfolio of match funding for the Community Ownership Fund. And hopefully at the end of the webinar, we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. Okay, so from local pubs and shops, village halls, community centres, libraries, sports fields, cinemas, the past decade has seen many communities lose these types of local amenities and buildings that have been of great importance to them. So we've seen the age of austerity, public spending cuts, periods of recession up to the present day. The UK government has recognised this longer term trend of communities losing amenities that bring people together and foster a sense of community pride. So to kind of meet this need, they've introduced the Community Ownership Fund, which is part of the kind of overall UK government levelling up agenda. Next slide, please, David. In 2021, the UK government launched the fund, which is £150 million in total, to support local communities in their efforts to acquire, maintain facilities and amenities and assets of local value that are most important to local communities. So the fund is intended to roll out over a 4-year period. Round one started in June 2021, so the first round of funding was opened in June 2021. I think there were about 15 to 20 projects that were successful in the first round, taking up just over £5 million of the fund. So there's still over £144 million left in the fund, and we're now into round two. Community groups can apply for up to £250,000 each to help establish a community-owned facility or to buy an asset for the community which is in danger of being lost. There are exceptional cases where communities can apply for up to £1 million. So I think in the first round, there was one project that successfully applied for £1 million. Applicants should be community and and or voluntary organisations that have formed as a legal community structure to apply for the fund. So examples of this would be community interest company or a community trust. And they have to do this in order to demonstrate that there's proper governance of the project, so governance behind the project. Groups that are in the process of forming a legal entity of that type can also apply. So if you're in the process but haven't actually completed the process of forming a community interest company, you can still apply. There's no published list, definitive list of what assets are eligible, so what projects are eligible, because the emphasis is on communities to set out what is important to them. But to give you a kind of idea, projects could include anything ranging from community-owned sports clubs, sporting and leisure facilities, music venues, small museums, galleries, parks, pubs, post office buildings, shops, and cinemas and theatres. And cinemas are actually named as an example in the documentation for the fund. And in general, what we're looking at are place-based assets or amenities which are important to the local community, which build connections between people and foster a sense of pride in the local area, but obviously are at risk of being lost without this community intervention. Finally, on this slide, an important kind of dimension of the fund is almost like a first step, is for the you as the community groups to list the amenity or the facility as an asset of community value. That's the kind of first step. Just to give you a little bit of background on this, the past decade has seen a significant rise in communities coming together, becoming more active, and joining together to save or take over assets which are significant for them. There's a thing called the Localism Act, and also another part of the law which relates to assets of community value. And these legal provisions give local groups the right to nominate a building or other land for listing by the local authority as an asset of community value. So you can nominate a building, for example, as an asset of community value with your local authority. And that's how you start to go about identifying a project for this fund. So the Community Ownership Fund will give communities the opportunity to identify assets of community value, have them listed, and then when they're put up for sale, it gives the local community group a little bit more time to raise the finance and prepare the bid in order to acquire that asset. Next slide, please, David. So let's have a look at the criteria for the fund. What do you have to say and do in your application to access the money? 4 areas in the application. You have to make a strategic case, first of all, why you need to make the intervention, why you need to save the building. You need to make a management case, so how you would manage the project and the asset after acquiring it for the community. What are the what's the business plan for the project? What's the what level of sustainability does it have, economic sustainability? Thirdly, what's the potential of the project to deliver community benefit? So what are the range of community benefits that your project will deliver? And then the 4th set of criteria, added value of the community asset based on community need. This is really about how the project fits in with other plans, other existing plans perhaps, for the local community. Next slide, please, David. So let's just do a quick sort of drill down into each of those sets of criteria. This is what you would actually be looking at if you're making an application to the fund. So first of all, the strategic case. This accounts for 30% of the assessment, so a good good chunk of the assessment is centered around this. And it's split up into different sort of headlines that headline criteria that you have to meet. So first of all, case for community intervention, essentially asking the question, why does the community need to intervene? You should include things like the risk currently facing the asset, why without community intervention the asset would be lost to the community, the role of the community asset that the community asset plays in your local place. So what services and amenities does it provide? And the impact which the loss of the community asset would have on the community. I think when you're looking at these with reference to cinema, you can see very simply the difference between having a local cinema and not having a local cinema, and the kinds of you can measure that quite simply in terms of the admissions, the service that a local cinema provides. It's often the case that in local authority surveys, when they ask local people what kinds of facilities they most want, that cinema comes out really close to the top, if not the main asset. So local cinema is very important, is proven to be very important to local communities. Okay, second sort of area under the strategic case is community support. So what level of community support exists and how can you demonstrate this? You should be able to provide evidence of support you have for your plans to save the community asset or amenity. Again, this might include some community engagement events that you might have run. So a cinema project, a community running a cinema project in East London that I worked with, ran some pilot screenings in their cinema before they sort of reopened it, to gauge the level of community need and interest in their project. You might have carried out community fundraising to evidence community support. So typically, again, with reference to cinemas, community cinemas often crowdfund at an early stage, again, as a means not only of getting the money, but to evidence the local community support for the project through the crowdfund. And then you also need to demonstrate how you've involved local people in your proposals and considered community views on the aims and objectives of your plan. So how have you corralled that community support and used the views and perhaps the expertise that exists already in the community to develop your plans. And then the fourth area under strategic case would be local partnerships and links to other plans. So what local partnerships are built into your plans and give them a sort of more solid basis, rooted in the community? Is there a basis of local support and involvement from the local council or other public bodies locally? What support do you have from other local organisations, businesses, local public sector organisations? How do your plans save the asset? How do your plans to save the asset relate to the aims of other local plans, such as neighbourhood plans, local economic strategies, health and wellbeing strategies? Again, all these things relate to local cinemas and are easy to describe in a narrative when referring to local cinemas. And then finally, under strategic case, there's a case to be made for the environmental sustainability of your project. So the fund welcomes projects that can support the journey to net zero and incorporate low and zero carbon approaches. I think in reference to cinema, there is a lot of discussion about greening cinemas at the moment. I don't think there's enough evidence yet to suggest a kind of template for a low or zero carbon cinema, but I think it's moving towards ideas around best practice for that. So if you look at a cinema like Depot in Lewes, it's very much at the forefront of environmental cinema operation. There's also an organisation called Julie's Bicycle, which offers lots of consultancy around greening cinemas and making cinemas as low carbon as possible. Next slide, please, David. So the next set of criteria is around the management case. And again, this accounts for 30% of the assessment. And this is really about how you propose to manage the project, both through the application process and the development process, but also in the longer term, once you've acquired the project. So it's about the financial viability of the business model. First of all, you'll need to include an overview of your business model to show that you've considered all the risks and deliverables associated with your project. You'll need to attach a full business plan around the project. Again, with reference to cinema in this regard, there are numerous cinemas that have gone through this kind of phase and developed feasibility studies for their cinemas, both technical and business feasibility studies for their projected cinemas, and also developed, of course, business plans for cinemas. So these things do exist. There are actually templates for these. I think an important aspect of this is that community cinemas that apply to the fund will need to demonstrate a fairly robust case for longer term economic sustainability. Again, there are sort of templates for this. The important thing to note, I think, is that the business model for a community cinema is going to be very different to the business model for commercial cinema. So there are some specifics to do with the business planning for a community cinema, to which a greater level of attention needs to be paid as part of the business planning. I can maybe talk about this a bit more later. For community cinemas in general, the level of local competition will be a key factor to the economic sustainability. So those located close to other cinemas will generally require a range of local, regional, and sometimes national partnerships and funding through which the cinema can leverage additional funds to serve that wider range of audiences within the community. I think more isolated cinemas, so if you have very little commercial competition within your locality, those cinemas can operate more as kind of amenity cinemas with a more wider range of programming and more popular film choices, which might mean that they're more sustainable without the need for other forms of partnership or public funding. Okay. Second aspect of management case, you need to demonstrate match funding and have very detailed full project costs. So you need to provide details of how much funding you're seeking from the Community Ownership Fund, your full project costs, sources of funding that you've already received to develop your project so far, sources of funding that you've already secured for the capital costs, and sources of funding that you plan to secure for your project. Community Ownership Fund provides up to a maximum of 50% of the capital costs to purchase or renovate or repair the community asset. So 50% can be accessed through the community ownership fund. You need to find the other 50% from other sources. And you need to demonstrate these other sources of funding that have already been secured or you're in the process of securing for the capital costs. Third dimension to management case, skills and resources that are needed to manage the asset. How have you considered the management requirements of your project, again, through the project period, the development period, but also in the longer term? What are the skills and resources that you need to ensure your organization has the right capacity and resources to be sustainable? So you need to demonstrate full set of planning in terms of staffing and resources. For independent cinema projects, I would say that this obviously needs to be fairly clearly set out in the business plan. I think for most independent cinemas, most community cinemas certainly, it requires some staff and trustees who have experience in the operation of not-for-profit activities, and especially not-for-profit cinema, if that's possible. So not-for-profit cinema settings, rather than a commercial cinema setting. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the community cinema model is very different, it's fundamentally different economically to a commercial cinema model. And a final set of criteria under the management case: community control, accountability, inclusiveness, and integration. So under this, you need to demonstrate that you're accountable to the local community that you represent. And you can do this by showing who is on your board, what the governance structures are, ways in which you will involve the local community in the running of the asset, your organization structure, and if there are any barriers to who can join the organization. I think an important part of this is that you will need to demonstrate that you've considered inclusiveness and integration issues as part of your proposals. So critically, how the community asset will be accessible and inclusive for all members of the local community, including underrepresented groups. So obviously in terms of cinemas, independent cinemas, there are a number of things that independent cinemas already do to demonstrate this, from different kinds of programming and in general programming a wider range of films to make the program highly accessible, to physical build aspects of their buildings, both in terms of facilities and decor, which make the building much more inclusive and appealing to all sectors of the community. Next slide, please, David. So the third criteria area is the potential to deliver community benefits. Again, this accounts for 30% of the assessment. And again, just to drill down on the areas that the fund managers will look at. First of all, what are the community benefits delivered? You'll need to demonstrate the community benefits of the asset and how these will be sustained and improved throughout the period of community ownership. So these benefits could be some of the following things: community pride and perceptions of the local area as a place to live. As I mentioned earlier, cinemas often come out very high in the list of things that local people find appealing or want in their local area. So they're obvious sites of community pride and making a locality much more attractive as a place to live. Secondly, social trust, social cohesion, and creating a sense of belonging. Participation in community life, arts and culture, or sport. I think the relation to cinema is obvious for that one. Community benefits of local economic outcomes, so the added employment that the asset offers, volunteering opportunities that the asset offers, development of skills and employability within the local community. Again, I think it's fair to say that that independent cinemas, community cinemas offer all of those things. And finally, additional social and well-being outcomes, such as delivering positive impact in physical and mental health, reducing loneliness and social isolation. I think that's a critical criterion as we emerge from the sort of pandemic lockdowns. And again, I think there's demonstrable evidence that cinemas can contribute to those social and well-being outcomes. Again, in reference to cinema in relation to community benefits, it's important to underline, I think, that cinemas are a cultural and entertainment form which bring people together. It's a shared experience. Indie cinemas, independent cinemas, community cinemas especially, are accessible to all sections of the community, regardless of social class, cultural background, economic status. Cinemas are a shared experience. They often become local social hubs, meeting places. So contemporary cinemas are much more than places where people go and can watch films together. They're much more like places where people will dwell for a certain amount of time and meet other people, spend longer time in the other facilities away from the kind of screening rooms. They're often perceived as landmarks of local cultural life, so people recognise areas through their cinemas, and quite clearly they reduce social isolation. They're open throughout the day. They offer very accessible opportunities for people to engage in social activities, social experiences. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the economic outcomes of independent cinemas are fairly obvious, I think, as well. So they offer employment, volunteering opportunities, keeping the audience spend in the locale of the community. So developing the community economy, especially in those cases where you don't have a cinema close by. So if the local cinema didn't exist, the spend would otherwise be taken out of the community, and the money would be spent in wherever the nearest commercial cinema would be. A final criteria section under potential to deliver community benefits is looking at community beneficiaries. So in this, you need to demonstrate which groups in the community currently use the asset and how they would benefit from protecting the asset, maintaining it in the longer term. So you need to show how the asset will be inclusive and deliver benefits for members of the wider community under community ownership. There may be one main beneficiary group within the community who primarily benefits from the asset, but I think what they're looking for really is a demonstration of a wider range of community groupings that would benefit from the asset. Again, cinemas can demonstrate this further down the line through the business plan, but by including ideas around programming and how to broaden the program out, how to develop particular screening slots for specific sectors of the local community, you can demonstrate this through building a kind of base of stakeholders for your community cinema, and also through looking at the audiences that come through eventually. So doing a kind of segmentation analysis of your audiences to get a true assessment of who the local community beneficiaries are. Next slide, please, David. And then the final criteria area for the fund is added value based on community need. This is a little bit more tricky to define. Interestingly, I think the fund managers probably think this as well. It only accounts for 10% of the assessment. It's really around the need to demonstrate community needs. And the way that you would do this is to look at how the project intersects or overlaps with other similar services or similar plans for the local community. So it might include an appraisal of other similar services in the area. Is what you're trying to say a unique amenity or service that people would otherwise have to travel elsewhere, and so you're saving it for the local community in a very specific sense. Does your project have the potential to address other local challenges? So, for example, if you expect your project to deliver increased pride of place to the area, please explain explain the impact this would have in relation to how local people currently feel about the local place or the need for regeneration. Cinema examples of this, there are quite a few examples around the UK of cinemas that have been used as lead developments, lead organisations in the regeneration of high streets, cultural quarters, regeneration areas in general. So over the past 30 or 40 years, there's quite a lot of evidence of cinemas leading in the regeneration of, for example, local high streets. They're seen as very much kind of key activities in that their cinemas are generally open all day. They are highly accessible, so they attract people from all sectors of the community. I think there's a statistic that 3/4 of the local population has visited a cinema in the past year. That's a fairly consistent stat. So highly accessible to most of the population. They generally serve to make. There's quite a lot of evidence that cinemas make the high street, especially in the evenings, more populated, more sort of participatory. They often come with improved street architecture, street design, and encourage safer neighborhoods. Cinemas often have a very strong visual presence, which adds to their kind of broad appeal, and the general accessibility of cinemas makes them very strong sites of local pride. So examples of that would be cinemas like Depot Lewis, the Lexi in Kensal Rise in London, or a cinema like the Rex in Berkhamsted. Is very much identified with the town. Next slide, please, David. Essential community ownership fund outcomes, just really to recap, you need to demonstrate the potential to deliver all of the following outcomes in your application. Your application needs to protect a community asset or amenity that's at risk and preserve its community value. It needs to develop a sustainable operating model to secure the long-term future of the community asset when it's in community ownership. You need to safeguard and improve the use of the community assets and associated local services and amenities. Next slide, please, David. It needs to increase the feelings of pride and improve perceptions of a local area as a place to live. It needs to improve social trust, cohesion, and a sense of belonging. And finally, it needs to, penultimately, it needs to increase local participation in community life, arts, culture, and sport. Needs to create additional local economic outcomes, create additional social and well-being outcomes, and you need to demonstrate community need for the facility. Okay, sorry that was a little bit rambling in parts, but it's very detailed and it's very much a kind of whistle-stop tour through the Community Ownership Fund. I'll now pass over to John Murray. John is a senior lending manager at the Charity Bank, and John can talk to you about the Charity Bank's facilities that are available to potential applicants to the Community Ownership Fund. Thanks, John.
Thanks, David. Thanks for taking us through there. A lot to cover, as you said, and some really important information around community benefit, which I did enjoy as well. David, if you're able to roll with the slides, that'd be really helpful. And I'll start from slide 1. That'd be great. Thank you. So yeah, to start off, Charity Bank, we are a social lender. So we lend only to charities and social enterprises, community organisations. We don't do any lending to private organisations, so lend to companies, companies lended by shares or partnerships, sole traders. We don't do any of that kind of finance. Go to slide 2, please. That'd be great. We've got quite a long history. We're coming up to our 20th anniversary this year. We like to lend to organisations that have a community and social impact. Obviously, cinemas fit that really well. David's given you a great run through of all the kind of different benefits that they give the local economy, employment, the regeneration of the high street as well. So I think there's a really good fit there with independent cinema offerings. And yes, we've done over £400 million of lending and over 1,100 loans over that kind of near 20-year time frame. We're also owned by an array of different charities and social purpose investors. I think that's a really positive point in terms of sharing that with your boards of trustees. If you do elect to get funding from Charity Bank, I think that would have a really good fit with your social mission as well. May I have the next slide, please? Here's a bit of a breakdown of kind of the areas that we have lent to already. I think which is useful just to give you an idea. Our customer base is diverse. I think that's really important. We need to be representing the communities that we fund. As you'll see there, community cinemas would be found within our arts lending that we've done, and obviously this is an area that we're keen to support. We see the great impact that independent cinemas and art offerings have on their communities and beyond. Have the next slide, if that's okay. So why would you use loan finance? I think the big part here is probably second to last bullet point, which is to form part of a match funding package. Obviously, you've heard about the Community Ownership Fund. Our funding would go alongside that, up to a maximum of 50%. That could help you if you're looking to go and buy your community asset. If it's maybe a dilapidated cinema that you want to bring back into community use, or if it's an existing cinema that you operate and you want to do some refurbishment work, then I think the Community Ownership Fund's a good match there. It obviously softens the overall cost for you. Great to get that grant, but it also wouldn't be restrictive. I'd look for other grants that are arts and impact focused as well. Any other kind of revenue cost grant funding that you can get to support your mission as well is really important. Our funding, yeah, it does a wide array of different things. We do a lot of property finance. So that's a lot of community organisations, faith organisations buying their own buildings. So I think that's probably one of our specialisms, and I think that's where we have a good alignment with the Community Ownership Fund. And yeah, I'll take the next slide if that's okay. So I've put some features here very briefly. I think one of the key points here is that when you get this Community Ownership Fund, if your application is approved, you've got 12 months from the date of offer to expend the grant. I think that's really important. I think you need to fit that within your business planning, your timescales of operation. You have to have that community benefit, which David discussed really well. The maximum grant level that you can get from the Community Ownership Fund would be £250,000. And therefore, I think that's important to say that obviously, if it's 50% funding, then the maximum that you could get through a loan would be £200,000. David also covered crowdfunding. You are able to get funding from other sources as well, and you might find that a loan is a helpful top-up mechanism to get to the overall goal or refurbishment amount for your cinema property. And yes, Community Ownership Fund will only contribute up to 50% of the total capital that you require. So what do we look for when we assess a loan? I think this is really important to go through this. I think the loan has to be affordable, otherwise it wouldn't be responsible to lend in the very first place. The organisation has to be sustainable. So I think you have to think about the revenue streams that you generate from operation. Community cinema could be a bit more multi-use. It could be that you could have kind of spoken word, comedy and other offerings potentially dependent on your cinema being suitable for that environment. I think these organisations are great when they do these things because it's, again, it kind of helps diversify the people that come through your doors. I think you need to obviously have a handle on kind of financial accounts. So it might be important to have somebody on your board of trustees that has a bit of a financial specialism to help you go through this. You might have to look at external help for finance as well. A bit of advisory service would be really helpful. I think the plan's got to be clear. David talked about kind of market research in the towns that you're operating or cities that you're operating in, especially if it's a newly acquisited cinema that you're going to go and buy. I think that's really important just to test the water and see what the likelihood of demand for your cinema is going to be. I think it's probably a bit easier if you're going to do some refurbishment work to an existing cinema because you already know your client base. But again, it doesn't stop you from looking at new ways to look at how you operate as well. In the past, when I've supported community organisations, they've used Power to Change guides to really good effect, and they have a great one on cafes and community cafe operations. That could also be a separate area that a cinema would look to operate from as well. And I'll take the next slide. Thank you. So there's my contact details there. I think it was a colder day than today, which is a bit warmer. I had my jumper on. Yeah, please, if you are not sure about anything, have any follow-up questions that you don't want to either type into the chat or ask on the Q&A at the end of our session today, please feel free to drop me a line. We can discuss what you're looking to do, or you can give me a call and we can have a discussion and see, how does your idea look, where you're operating from, what you're looking to do, and see how it all fits together. David's given you a great description of how Community Ownership Fund works. I'm happy to speak to you about the funding that we provide. I think it's important also for me to say that the funding is most likely going to be base rate linked variable rate funding. In terms of security, that's typically a legal charge on the building. So this is like a mortgage style of lending. It's typically longer term. And also obviously when there's a lease in place, that we wouldn't ever lend shorter than we wouldn't provide a loan for a longer time frame than the lease has to run. That's something if you're operating from lease premises to bear in mind as well. And yeah, I think I'll hand back now. I'm happy to take questions on from the floor, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. Thank you David as well. So there are a couple of questions. Some of them have been answered by other attendees, which is great. In case anyone missed that in the chat, there was a question about the options if your application to have the cinema listed as an ACV has been rejected. Does that exclude us from this funding stream? And another attendee was at government briefing for the fund and said that whilst ACV would of course bolster an application, it would not be essential. I've got another question as well. I'm trying to have a look in the for some of the answers, but one that I can't answer might be for David, is that in your presentation you mentioned about cinemas crowdfunding, and do you have any examples of a cinema that's done this successfully? Cinemas.
Yeah, most recent example is a new cinema in Acton in West London called Act One, which raised funding to redevelop what was previously the Acton Central Library, and they've successfully reopened it as a single screen cinema with plans to open a second screen. And their funding came from various public sources, like I think the Mayor of London's office, but also they crowdfunded for a substantial amount of it, were successful in achieving their crowdfund target. And as I said earlier, what it enabled them to do was demonstrate that there was significant local support, substantial local support for the project through the crowdfund. That's the beauty of crowdfunding in a way. Yeah. It's not, yeah. It's the kind of constituency of people that it brings to you, as well as the money.
I'll take one more for again, I think for David before I take one for John. So if there is already an independent venue in the area, but it's not fully a community cinema, so maybe it's running more as a commercial in the present moment, can you apply so you can run a community cinema as part of the venue, or would it be wiser to run it in another venue in the area? I should just say now that neither David or John work for the UK government, so I'm just gonna put that at the start of it. But David, if you have any ideas from your reading on that, or John, that would be helpful.
Well, I think if there already exists an independent cinema in the locale, I don't think there's anything to stop you applying, of course, but it is potentially much more difficult to make a case for the in terms of the need and the benefits that an additional community cinema might have. So I think you would need to focus your attention in the application on making that case for community benefit, and also the strategic case. Why is the local community intervening to develop a community cinema when there already exists a cinema provision in the local area? That's what I would say for that one.
Great, thank you. John, you mentioned in your presentation about possible other sources of funding. So someone's asked about projects that you've come in before and helped and contributed to, some examples of where that other sources of funding might have come from. Maybe if do you have any specific examples?
Typically it's quite an array, so you can have a bit of an arts impact fund. When I've done community organisation funding, I've lent alongside Power to Change before as well. I think it's really important to have a good kind of assessment of small and large grants. Some of the best community organisations that I've come across are very good at getting an array of different grants to do different things. But I would say for independent cinema offerings, I would look at other smaller grants that are going to help you, either if you want to do some refurbishment if they're specifically for that, or you're going to look at other areas and they're going to have that purpose. I tend to use the School for Social Entrepreneurs, have a really good guidance on different grants that are available. They also tell you what the grant purpose is for as well. I think that's kind of really important, to be kind of very narrow specific and find that grant that's really going to fit well with what you're operating in and how you are working to ensure you save time and you're applying to the right organisation.
Thank you. I think I've got two more questions. One of them is, three. Our cinema is a registered charity and formed as a community trust. We already own the building. It's an asset transfer from the local authority a few years ago, but it needs refurbishment and hardware upgrades. Is this something that could be accessed via this fund? And I'm trying to look on the website as well as we go through.
I think it is if the facility is in danger of being run down and not being sustainable. So yeah, I would have a thorough look through at the gov.uk website for the fund, just to make sure. But I suspect it is eligible if the applicant has already formed as a community organisation in some way. So did you say it was a community trust, Gemma?
It says, sorry, I was on the charity, yeah.
Yeah, so I suspect they are eligible, but refer to the kind of guidelines in detail.
Yeah, I've just had a look as well. It does say that, David, you're absolutely right. So if there's a realistic chance that the asset could be sold or transferred into, organisations, who already own their asset are eligible to apply for funding to renovate, provided that the asset would otherwise be at risk of closure or loss. So, but renovations that improve the asset, but that are not essential to its continued operation, will not be funded. Yeah. Okay, so looking at the time, so one more. If an existing cinema building is deemed too expensive to redevelop, would the fund be available to redevelop or build a cinema in a different location but in the same town? So I think this is actually about building a new cinema.
I mean, again, I think it is. All of that fits within the eligibility criteria. Obviously, you would have to make a very strong case for developing a new asset rather than preserving the existing asset. I would say it's quite unusual for that to be the case as well. That that it would cost less to build something new than develop an existing facility. Although, I suppose it's possible. I've come across a lot of old cinema buildings which are obviously very expensive to redevelop and upkeep, because they were designed and built in the 1920s or 30s, and require a lot of work. So yeah, I think the key is to make the key would be to make the case that the again, that the community intervention is in some way saving cinema as a service, as an amenity for local people, rather than focusing on the building as such. Yeah. So if the building already exists, if a cinema already exists, but it's very run down and it would cost far too much to upgrade it and maintain it, then I think you could make a case for moving that cinema provision to a different location, apply to the fund on the basis that you were preserving a cinema service for your local community.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, David. I think we're going to finish right on time, actually. So that's great. I'm just going to just quickly, Angela's asked when are the deadlines for the fund. So that information's on the website. I think there's a current windows open at the moment until the 19th of August, but I think they're saying there'll be 2 more bidding windows before March 2023. So have a look at the link that was right at the top of the chat, or it's on the ICO website on the page for this event, and you find more information there. I just wanted to take the time to thank John and David for participating today and giving us a lot of information. We're really keen to see cinemas apply to this fund, and we think it's a really good fit. So if you have any more questions at all, please do get in touch with us. We'd be really happy to help. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. And yes, I hope to see you all on another event soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.